So we'll get started. Let me just start recording. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Samvaad-Talk. We are starting a new theme starting this week. So this is on the theme on cyber security. So just a second. I'll just sorry, once again. So this is the Samvaad theme on cyber security. And here we have the first talk by our alumnus who was also a gold medalist in that year. So we are happy to have Yashvanth Kondi here. I will hand over the stage to the session chair, that is Professor Ashish Chowdhury, who did the hard job of grooming Yashvanth while he was here. So off to you, Ashish, and have a good Samvaad talk.
Thanks a lot, Jaya. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce the speaker of today's talk, Yashvanth Kondi. And he will be talking about practical threshold cryptography from native assumptions based on some of his exciting research works published in top avenues in cryptography and security like IACR Crypto and IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy. Here is a brief biography of Yashvanth. Yashvanth Kondi is currently a fourth-year PhD candidate at Northeastern University in Boston, where he is supervised by Professor Abhishelat. His research interests lie broadly in the theoretical and applied aspects of cryptographic protocol design with a focus on multi-party computation techniques. He is an alumnus of the first integrated MTech batch of IIIT-B, where he was advised by myself. Rare feat achieved by Yashvanth is that his MTech thesis work got published in the Crypto 2017 conference. So welcome, Yashvanth, and over to you.
Thanks for that introduction. Can you see my screen, the one that's the presenter view? Okay, I'm going to assume yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'll be speaking about practical threshold cryptography from native assumptions. This is based on a few papers. These are joint works with Megan Chen, Lan Cohen, Chad Turner, Francois Garriot, Issa Lee, Payman Mohasser, Valeria Nikolenko, Shula Rosefield, and Abhishelat. Okay, so I'm going to recap or possibly introduce for the first time to some of you the concept of a digital signature, which works as follows. So let's say Bob has a secret signing key, let's call it SK, and some sort of correlated public key, which we can call PK. And PK is known to the world at large. So given a message, Bob can sign it with SK so that anyone who knows the public key PK can verify that Bob did indeed sign the message using some sort of public verification function. The security notion that we would like from the signature scheme is for it to achieve unforgeability, which means that it should be hard to compute a signature on any message if you don't have the signing key or the secret key. So as a sample application, let's say that Bob would like to send some Bitcoin to his friend Alice. So he first creates a message to this effect. Then he takes out his laptop on which he has a signing key. He presses a button, and then he produces a signature to attest to this fact, to sign this message. The signed message is then broadcast to the rest of the world, and that completes the transaction. However, an attacker could enter the picture and hack into Bob's laptop and steal his secret key. And this is a bad situation because given his secret key, she essentially has unrestricted access to Bob's account, as she can sign messages on his behalf. And so the attacker can steal all of Bob's funds and divert all of his money to herself. And this is quite bad. So the point of this story is to bring out the danger of having a single point of failure and keeping the secret key hidden from attackers. So one way of getting around this is that we could have Bob split his signing key into multiple fragments so that even if one of the fragments is compromised, the original signing key itself stays safe. And this notion is achieved by a threshold signature, where the secret key is split into multiple fragments, and each of these fragments lives on a different device. and these devices must interact and collaboratively sign a message in order to produce a signature. And one of the important things that we want from such a system is that the signature that comes out of this distributed threshold way of signing should be indistinguishable from an ordinary signature. It should look just as though you ran the signing algorithm by itself. So to make clear the adversary model, first I'll define the corruption threshold that we're interested in. We're interested in a dishonest majority of corruption, specifically the case in which all but one device in the signing party in the set of signing devices could be corrupt. And in terms of adversarial behavior, if there's a protocol described to produce messages in some fashion, a malicious attacker who corrupts one of the devices may arbitrarily deform the messages in the protocol, and the protocol should be resilient to these kinds of deviations. So in the context of threshold cryptography, this provides really strong guarantees, as you'll be able to quantify over the large class of adversarial behavior. I say this because for the most part, solutions to threshold crypto problems where either of these conditions are relaxed. So for instance, if you're looking at honest majority, or if you're looking at semi-honest adversaries that follow the protocol, you will be able to find fairly satisfying answers from classic literature back in the 80s and 90s, or simple corollaries thereof. All right, so to make things concrete, let's start with our first concrete example of a signature scheme, specifically that of Schnorr signatures. It's an elegant scheme based on the hardness of the discrete logarithm problem. And I'll quickly recap the tools that we'll need to understand Schnorr, which will also be shared by subsequent schemes, so it's worth understanding. So first, we need a hash function h that maps any string to an integer that's mod q, and a group that we're going to use for the signature. That will consist of a set of group elements. That's this bold G here. And for the rest of the stock, the group elements that we're going to use for Schnorr and Schnorr-like schemes are going to be elliptical groups. So every element in the group will be a point on some elliptic curve. You don't usually have to think about the actual geometric object because this abstraction will capture everything that we need from it. The group will be generated by this value G, the group generator, and the group will be of order Q, where Q is some large prime. And when I say large in practice, this is of the order of 2 to the 200, 256. So like gigantic, basically. And also we have an addition law that's defined for the group. And what I mean by this, I'll quickly cover in 60 seconds on cyclic groups. Essentially, if x and y are elements of the group, then x plus y, that's applying the addition law, will give you back a z that is also in the group. Any x that's in the group can be written as a product of an integer mod q, that's lowercase x, and the group generator. And this lowercase x in this case, we'll call it the discrete logarithm of capital X. And this also gives us some nice structure, which is that if you compute x plus y, where the addition operation is over the integers mod q, multiplied by the group generator, and then multiplied by the group generator, you get the same result as if you were to multiply x by the generator and add that to y multiplied by the generator using the group addition law. So intuitively, the discrete logarithm problem is that if you're given a random element in the group, then your task is to find the discrete logarithm of the group. So given capital X, find lowercase x. And the reason we're going to be working with elliptic curves primarily is because the best known algorithms for the discrete logarithm problem in many elliptic curves. Sorry, is that a question? Okay. Yeah, so the best known algorithms for the discrete logarithm problem in many elliptic curve groups is believed to be in the order of the square root of the size of the group. So if you have a group of 256 bits, then the expected time to solve the discrete logarithm problem is of the order of 2 to the 128, which is satisfyingly large. So don't worry if that didn't stick. Very informally, I'm going to denote scalar elements. I'm going to denote integers mod q with lowercase letters and the corresponding elliptic curve points with capital letters. So all you have to keep in mind is going from lowercase to uppercase is easy, but going from uppercase to lowercase is hard. So specifically, or rather, to attach some concrete numbers to this, in practice, exponentiation, that is multiplying like a lowercase x by the group generator, is of the order of about 30 microseconds for a number of useful elliptic curves. Whereas going the other way, that is going from an elliptic curve point back to an integer mod q, is of the order of many billions of years. That's the best that we know how to do. Cool. So now that we have these tools in place, by the way, please stop me if you have any questions or anything. I'm happy to clear them up. Right. So now that we have these tools in place, let's see how to create a Schnorr signature. Key generation is quite straightforward. We begin by sampling a secret key from ZQ, and then multiplying the secret key by the generator to get the public key, PK. So remember that PK is the thing that's exposed to the outside world, while SK is the thing that we have to keep private. And intuitively, because computing discrete logarithms is hard, it's okay to reveal PK. Like it can't like sort of work backwards and figure out what SK was efficiently. And so now, given that we have this signing algorithm, given that we have this key generation algorithm, how do we actually use it to sign messages? So the signature algorithm works as follows. First, we begin by sampling an instance key k, also from ZQ, just like the secret key. Then multiply this by the group generator to get this nonce r. This is a value that's going to be used just once and never repeated. Then we compute E as the hash of this nonce r and the message. And then we compute the signature itself is going to be a linear combination of the nonce that we just sampled and the signing key from earlier. And the weight of this linear combination, it comes from the hash that we just computed. And that's it. That's the signature, the linear combination along with the nonce.
I had one doubt. Yes. So is computing G power like -1 in the dimension of groups a easy problem, or it's difficult? Because
sure. I mean, if you mean -1 as in
inside a group,
like the equivalent of -1 mod q, then yeah, that's easy.
So if we just multiply it, like, so it will reveal the secret key, right? Like in the Schnorr key generation algorithm, because PK we are defining as SK into G.
Mm-hmm.
So
what we want is SK, as in SK is the signing key.
Yeah.
So how would you do this?
Like we can just like dot G power -1 both the sides. It will, because public key we know it is in the.
Okay. So
it is known.
You can't divide by G, as in when I say that it's the secret key times the group generator, this is not
it's
not integer multiplication.
It's not arithmetic, that I understand. But inside the groups, is it possible or not? That's what I was asking.
Okay, so so if you compute -1 times G is not the same as computing like G inverse, if that's what you were thinking. Like you can't, like there's no well-defined like elliptical division operation.
Okay. So there's no well-defined G inverse. Yeah, okay, cool then.
Yeah. Sure. So, right, so the way we verify a signature is basically just by checking the signing equation, but in the curve group. Just to like make this explicit, if you like simplify the terms in the verification equation, what you'll see is that you're just checking whether S is the same equation that I wrote for S earlier times G. It's fairly straightforward. There's like no magic here. Okay, so now how can we distribute Schnorr signing? Right. So in principle, there are lots of nice theorems from the early days of multi-party computation, where you can express any efficiently computable function as a circuit, as a Boolean circuit, let's say, and invoke some general theorem for multi-party computation and instantiate like a threshold version of this function. Like this is all feasible like efficiently for some definition of efficient. But while this is asymptotically efficient, or while this is theoretically efficient in that there is some polynomial that expresses the cost of this operation, concretely, the circuit representations of group arithmetic especially is particularly large. It's prohibitively expensive in most scenarios. So concretely, if you were to take the generic route, like if you were to invoke these theorems from the 80s to compute this function generically, this would take tens of minutes or hours even to sign a single message. So the threshold Schnorr protocol that you would get from this generic method would be about, I don't know, it's like 10 million times slower than if you were to just run a single party version of Schnorr on your machine. So instead of going the generic route, we exploit the fact that the group that Schnorr is instantiated with has some nice algebra that we can use to construct a custom threshold signing protocol. And the custom protocol is going to be about just as efficient as the single party signing algorithm. So before we do that, we have to understand how we share secrets. So let's say that X is some element in ZQ, it's an integer mod Q. We can split X into two random halves, XA and XB, such that XA plus XB gives back X. This is called an additive sharing. And then we give each share to each device in the system. In this case, there are only two devices. And going forward, I'm going to denote the common secrets in green, and occasionally they're being closed in square brackets. That's going to denote the fact that they are shared. And the party-specific secrets will be in red and blue. So here XA is known to the phone, XB is known to the laptop, and if you take their sum, you get back the secret that you started out with, which is X. So let's see what happens if one of the devices is corrupt. Let's say the phone. So if you block out the things that the phone doesn't know, it's easy to see that conditioned on us having chosen the sharing uniformly, there's no information whatsoever about the original secret in the view of this corrupt phone. Again, yeah, so no magic going on here. It's just additive secret sharing. If you have one half of a sum, you don't know what the sum is. So let's say we have another secret Y that's shared the same way. It's split into YA and YB, which add up to Y. A nice property of this secret sharing scheme is that it's easy to compute any linear combination of the secrets. So for instance, if I want to compute Z, which I'm going to define as C times X plus Y, where C is some public constant, just applying the same operation locally to these secret shares gives me shares of Z. So if I compute ZA as CXA plus YA and ZB as CXB plus YB, just adding these two up, I'll get back Z that's of the form that I want. So linear combinations are easy, is the takeaway. Right, so this is our Schnorr key generation again. Let's see how we can use the secret sharing scheme to distribute key generation. We basically have the parties emulate exactly what the single party protocol does. Sorry, the single device protocol does. First, begin by sampling your own versions of SKA, SKB from ZQ. Multiply this by the group generator to get pKa and pKb, and save these values for later. These are your shares of this signing key and the public key. And again, to make the relationship concrete, the common secret SK is going to be the sum of the fragments SKA and SKB. And the common secret, and the common public key PK that's going to be exposed to the outside world is the sum of pKa and pKb. Over here, the sum is group addition, not integer, but that's not super important. So again, the same principle applies. If one of the devices were to be corrupted, because the other device stays honest, essentially the property of additive secret sharing tells you that the common secret stays perfectly hidden. Perfectly, the notion is perfect. Intuitively, computing SKB given PKB is just as hard as computing SK given PK, which, if you remember, was hard because of the discrete log problem. Cool. So now that that's out of the way, let's see how to do Schnorr signing. The first half of Schnorr signing, if you observe, is structurally identical to the key generation thing. So that simple protocol from key generation, this works again. And remember that linear combinations are very easy to compute with additive shares. Remember the whole thing with the Z and the X and Y. So over here, we can treat E as a public constant and K and Sk as the secrets. And the signature S is just a linear combination that's weighted by a public constant. And so that's a simple trick that we can apply from the secret sharing to get back this S thing in a distributed way. Concretely, the protocol that this induces is, let's say we have additive shares of Ska and Skb. We can then sample additive shares of Ka and Kb. Sorry, additive shares of K, Ska, and Kb, and execute the same steps as the single party protocol. Compute Ra and Rb respectively as Ka, Kb times the proof generator. Exchange these R values, add them up. Again, this is the standard secret sharing reconstruction. Compute E as the public value that's hashing the nonce in the message. And now this is the linear combination step. S is a linear combination of K and Sk, so we can distribute this linear operation through the shares. So basically, take my word for it if you don't want to step through the thing individually, but if you add up Sa and Sp, you're going to get back K minus Sk times E, which is just the original green shared S that we would like. This is the signature. And this generalizes to n parties easily. All we needed for Schnorr signing was just this one linear combination step, and that kind of solved everything. Cool. So that was a nice protocol, and that certainly wasn't a toy. As in, this protocol already achieves security against passive adversaries, and it can be made malicious, secure against a malicious, arbitrarily deviating adversary quite easily. It's just one extra step of adding a commitment round. So the takeaway here is that Schnorr signatures are old, that is, they're well studied, which is a good thing in cryptography. They're compact and fast to generate and verify. They're practically very nice. And they're easy to thresholdize, as in it's easy to distribute the computation of a Schnorr signature. And these are all excellent properties. So ideally, we should be done. This is where the story of threshold cryptography should perhaps reach a major landmark. But unfortunately, Schnorr's signature scheme, when it was introduced in the 90s, was patented, which has made it a major barrier for internet adoption. Even though the patent expired recently, the damage has been done because most of the protocols that have been standardized before the patent expired don't support Schnorr. So much of the infrastructure doesn't support Schnorr signatures. So just having a threshold Schnorr scheme is not going to help you that much in practice at the moment. And this sort of extends to the other schemes that did end up being standardized. That is, thresholdization was not really a first-class concern when choosing crypto systems with internet protocol standards. There have been, there are other considerations that have taken priority, such as how much space does it take on hardware, how efficient can it be on hardware, or resilience to some sort of attacks, things like this. So our focus in the field of threshold cryptography today, especially if you're interested in things of practical relevance, is thresholdizing crypto systems that have already been widely deployed. So which ones are these? As a sort of useful reference point, we can look at NIST's multi-party threshold cryptography project, which aims to produce guidelines and recommendations for widely used crypto systems. So we'll take NIST as our gold standard for this. These are the algorithms you want to thresholdize. Incidentally, NIST, in case you haven't come across it before, sets a lot of standards for technology in the US, and that ends up percolating to a lot of different ecosystems, I guess. So we can start with AES, which is the Advanced Encryption Standard, and also cover other algorithms such as RSA, ECDSA, and Fdsa. These are broadly the four different cryptographic crypto systems that NIST would like to thresholdize in its multi-party threshold cryptography project. I'll cover each of these one by one. So syntactically, AES is different from the rest because AES is symmetric key in that both the sender and the receiver of the cryptographic object share the same key. The other schemes that I've described here are public key in that they're asymmetric. The sender and the receiver have different keys. The cryptographic technology that underlies AES is also different. It's a block cipher. The details of these aren't important at the moment. The cryptographic technology that underlies RSA is factoring-based cryptography, like not in a literal sense, but generally it relies on large numbers being hard to factor. ECDSA and Fdsa both are elliptical-based crypto systems, kind of like Schnorr. As for the nature of the computation, what is it like to express as a Boolean circuit? As in the question over here is what's the theoretical circuit complexity, and also practically how large are the circuits that these functions induce. AES is unstructured, which means that we don't really have much hope for custom protocols, but fortunately, it also happens to have a small Boolean circuit representation, so we can use genetic techniques. So if we're thinking of how to compute threshold AES, we think of generic multi-party computation generally. On the other hand, RSA, ECDSA, and Fdsa, because they're based on more structured numbers, they're based on more structured sort of cryptographic assumptions. They do permit custom protocols. There is hope that we can construct some nice, we can exploit that algebra to construct some nice custom protocols, which is a relief because the circuits that they induce in the Boolean circuit form, if you were to use generic MPC, is huge. So this is sort of what we'll be focusing on. Like how can we construct custom protocols to thresholdize RSA, ECDSA, and Fdsa? And this is, I guess, the last you'll see of AES for some time. So the rest of this talk is going to be like structured roughly like this. Most of my time will go towards ECDSA, and I'll spend some time on Fdsa and RSA. Also full disclosure, I kind of omitted AES because I have papers on these topics, but not on AES. Okay, so let's look at the elliptical crypto systems. So the distributed key generation, the key generation and therefore the distributed key generation of both ECDSA and Fdsa are identical to Schnorr. The place where we encounter some troublesome nonlinearity, things that are going to make life difficult for us as threshold cryptographers, is in the signing part of the system. So let's recap what Schnorr signatures look like. I'm just highlighting the parts that are kind of important for Schnorr here. And to contrast these with ECDSA and Fdsa, I'll put them next to Schnorr. ECDSA is quite close to Schnorr for the first half, but the second half is where it deviates and it has some strange nonlinearity that we'll have to deal with. Fdsa is interestingly the opposite. It has the same second half as Schnorr, but the first half is some weird nonlinear function. And so this is going to be interesting to explore because we have like both halves in different systems, and like we can see what to do with this. Okay, so ECDSA, or the elliptical digital signature algorithm, was devised by Scott Vanstone in 1992 and has been standardized by NIST a while ago. It's different enough from Schnorr that the patent didn't apply to it, so it's enjoyed much more, rather much wider deployment than Schnorr. Basically, it's a canonical signature scheme in many internet systems. Right, so let's look at the structure of ECDSA and why it's irritating to distribute. So if we focus on exactly what the problem is, it's that the secret key Sk and the instance key K are both secret values, as in these are both values that had to be hidden from the outside world. And in the ECDSA equation, they have to be multiplied. Like we had to combine these in a nonlinear way, basically. And additionally, we also have to compute this modular inverse, this like division. K is a secret value and is present in like the numerator in R, but it's in the denominator in the signing equation. So this will create some problems for us because it's a nonlinear operation. In case you notice this Rx value, don't worry about it. It's basically something specific to the like representation of the geometric object, the elliptical curve. For our purposes, it's not going to matter because it's a public constant. So like you can safely ignore this term. So to help us in these tasks, I'm going to introduce this notion of a secure multiplication, where two devices have inputs alpha and beta, which they provide to this multiplication primitive. Or you can think of it as this black box that takes in values, spits out values as per some structure. We will talk about how to instantiate this box later, but for now, just take it on faith that it can be done. Right, so this multiplication box gives us outputs C and D, which maintain this correlation that C plus D will be alpha times beta. We can basically use this as a gadget to split a product of secret inputs, alpha and beta, into additive secrets C and D. And this is going to be useful in a number of scenarios. I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into exactly how to use these because the techniques are just time-consuming but not very novel. There's one that so division can be solved with some application of this multiplication gadget. And multiplication of secret values, which is the other problem with ECDSA, can also be solved with some classic techniques. And so to fill in the gaps, what remains to be done is like, we have to talk about how to actually instantiate this object, this multiplier, with a concrete protocol. And then we have to make sure that these multipliers, because there are many of them, are used in a consistent way. So broadly, there are two different methods to instantiate this multiplication object, and it's sort of a microcosm of secure computation at large. One method is using homomorphic encryption, additively homomorphic encryption, not fully, which is low on bandwidth, but tends to be somewhat heavy to compute. Oblivious transfer is the other way that we could instantiate this object, which has the exact opposite performance characteristic. It's high on bandwidth, but it's fairly light. Finally, we can tie things together with some zero-knowledge proofs and checking some relationships in the elliptical group. If you don't know what a zero-knowledge proof is, don't bother. It's not super important to understand this part. Right, so a brief history of this problem. There were some limited schemes that were based on Pi-A to solve this threshold ECDSA problem. Pi-A's encryption scheme, you can think of it as somewhat of the same flavor as RSA, as in it's based on factoring type assumptions. And it also has this additional property of additive homomorphism. We're not really going to explore additive homomorphism, so it's not something we really need to understand. So there's some limited schemes by McKenzie and Reiter and Gennaro Ferdinand and Linda that achieve threshold ECDSA. More recently, this Pi-A-based approach has been generalized to a full, like a complete threshold ECDSA system, as in with fully distributed key generation and signing and things. Gennaro and Goldfeder, Little, Sandalucci were both CCS 18. And more recently, Canetti and friends had a paper at CCS that added some nice qualitative dimensions to this. Another way of instantiating additively homomorphic encryption is using this other mathematical object called class groups of imaginary quadratic order. Again, not super important as to exactly how this is done, but we'll talk about the performance trade-offs in using each of these schemes. Oblivious transfer is the tool that I used with my group at Northeastern to give another candidate solution to threshold ECDSA. And this approach was generalized more recently by Dalskov and friends. And we can now examine the trade-offs that you'll face if you choose to go with additive homomorphic encryption versus OT. So like I said, homomorphic encryption is generally more compact, but more expensive to deal with. More expensive to operate on. Concretely, we can think of comparing these schemes in terms of, let's start with some fixed cost for signing for a single party. And every time I add an additional device, how much extra do I have to pay? As in, what's the overhead? If I keep incrementing the size of the system by one, what does each device on the system have to pay? This sort of roughly captures the performance characteristics along the dimensions of bandwidth and computation for each of these approaches. So class groups are the smallest and the heaviest. Pi-A is somewhere in the middle, and OT is at the end of the thing. As in, there's roughly an order of magnitude difference between, let's say, like OT and Pi-A. Order of magnitude more communication, but like a couple of orders of magnitude less in computation, which I'll make the case is like a reasonable trade-off. So in our work, we showed that using OT to instantiate this multiplication object is nice. In addition to these quantitative benefits, is also qualitatively nice because we can prove security under native assumptions, and we can get malicious security using checks that aren't exactly zero-knowledge proofs, but there are going to be some like statistical and some computational checks using only a small constant number of exponentiations of curve multiplications. And I highlight the native assumptions part over here because pi and class groups are not really native to ECDSA. They're based on a form of arithmetic that's foreign to elliptic curves. And some of the pi schemes even have to make some extra like ad hoc assumptions about the way that these pi groups and elliptic curves interact in order to be able to prove security. On the other hand, OT I will talk about. It can be instantiated with assumptions that you would be comfortable making if you're already using ECDSA. And the small constant number of operations to check consistency is a big win for us because other works typically have operations that are linear on the number of devices with some fairly large constants as well. This all ties into why we have a much lower computation cost with OT. All right, so what is OT? It's this really useful primitive that solves the following scenario. Let's say one of the devices has messages M0, M1, the other one has MB. The OT box delivers MB to the receiver, as in the sender who sent M0 and M1 doesn't find out which message was delivered to the receiver, and the receiver who chose one of these two messages doesn't find out what the message, the other message that he didn't choose is. We can instantiate this, like I said, with the same elliptic curve that ECDSA uses. So this is where the native assumption part comes in. And with OT extension, which is this tool that you can use to amortize the cost of OT, it costs only a few microseconds per instance of OT, which is really cool. All right, so now how do we actually build a multiplier object? There's a classic work of Gilboa from 1999 that shows how to do this. Basically, we start with the inputs alpha and beta of the two parties, which are integers. The party playing the receiver and the OT takes the bit decomposition of their value. So you can think of BI as being the ith bit of beta. So this is just write it down as a binary string and interpret it as a sequence of bits. And now each bit of this beta value is going to be fed as an input to this to an OT multiplier thing. The ith instance of OT inside the multiplier is going to have the ith bit of this receiver's input. Now this gets problematic if the other device, that's the sender, is corrupt. Because let's say that there is a certain format that has to be maintained among these messages. I don't think it's worth going into the exact details of this format, but I take it on faith that there is a format, and it's possible to not stick to this format. And that's exactly what can happen. The adversary can decide to send some malformed message instead of the good one, and it can choose malformed messages carefully in such a way that it can launch this attack where it finds out what choice bits the receiver put in on the other end if it's successful in its attack. This is an explicit attack, as in it's not like a hypothetical. So it's very clear that Gilboa's protocol only works against semi-honest adversaries, as in against adversaries who follow the protocol. So in our work, before we use it for ECDSA, we have to harden it to tolerate malicious adversaries as well. And the way we do this is, instead of feeding the receiver's input directly into the OT, we first encode beta using some high entropy encoding scheme into some new value beta star, which is an inflated, redundant, but highly randomized encoding of beta. So BI star is going to be the ith bit of beta star, and we're going to use these B star values in place of the B values directly. So what this means is that the attacker, when it cheats in this protocol, is going to learn values of B star, not of B. And we're going to use this fact that it's not able to get to B directly. Essentially, the property here is that any S bits of beta star that are taken in isolation reveal nothing about beta. We can take some ideas from like really classic works about cryptography from the subset sum problem, basically this paper by Multiplier now, to construct such an encoding scheme that has this property. And in addition to this, we also construct a check mechanism so that every time the sender of the OT cheats, every time the sender tries to learn an additional bit of the beta star value, it doubles the chance of getting caught. So it increases exponentially in the number of cheats, basically. Like the chance that you get caught increases exponentially in the number of cheats. So taking these two facts in combination gives us this nice property that the adversary is able to penetrate the encoding scheme undetected with the probability of less than 2 to the minus s, where s is this parameter for the randomized encoding scheme. So what this means is that the probability that the adversary is able to guess exactly the right cheats to make, or the probability that the attacker is able to go through and subvert the entropy that we introduced in this, and to actually read a useful bit about the other party's input, is less than 2 to the minus s. Concretely, in practice, you would set s to be 60 to 80 or something like this. So again, we're in the 1 in a billion kind of chance regime, which we're perfectly okay with. And so to summarize threshold ECDSA, concretely, the bandwidth and computation costs are traded off in orders of magnitude in terms of computation and bandwidth, and OT-based ECDSA sits at one end of the spectrum with relatively high computation, but relatively high bandwidth cost, but very low computation cost. So yeah, and we also show some consistency checks and whatnot to make sure that everything works properly. I have slides at the end of this if people are interested in listening to it, but I think it's better to move on to some more diverse topics. And yeah, we showed through an implementation and some benchmarks that this is quite practical in realistic scenarios. Again, there are benchmark numbers in the paper. I don't think there's a lot of value in talking about it right now. Just a quick note about since we have 3 different schemes that occupy 3 different points on the spectrum, the story doesn't end there, right? We have to talk about what does this actually mean for the real world. So the question we have to ask is communication really the bottleneck, or is computation the bottleneck? And I make the case that it's usually in many scenarios it's not communication that's the bottleneck. For instance, in mobile applications which are human initiated, that is a bunch of people manually press buttons on their phone or device or whatever to start threshold signing. Working out the bandwidth cost for our protocol is quite reasonable, less than 4 megabits or something with the threshold of 4, which is in most places, or many places, well within the performance envelope of LTE. And with 5G coming and whatnot, this is still going to be quite responsive. And on the other end of the spectrum, where we have large-scale automated as opposed to manual occasional things, what we're trying to optimize for is throughput over here. So in both the low threshold and the high threshold settings, if we look at the throughput, whether we are going to hit the computation barrier first, whether we're going to hit the bandwidth barrier first, it seems like we're going to hit the computation barrier before bandwidth. So it makes sense to optimize for computation rather than bandwidth. Basically, if you have gigabit connections between your servers, it's highly unlikely that you'll saturate. It's highly unlikely that you'll saturate your bandwidth before you saturate your compute power. That's just something to think about when making this choice, or when deciding what trade-off to make between different threshold ECDSA schemes, or I guess in general different threshold crypto systems. And so that's the ECDSA part of the talk done. Now let's move on to FDSA. The Edwards curve digital signature algorithm was devised by Bernstein with Langer, Schwab, and Young in 2011. And it's a variant of Schnorr's signatures that's instantiated with a careful choice of parameters, including the exact elliptical that they use, which is an Edwards curve, which is where the name comes from. And it's gradually seeing increased deployment. I think it's a lot of open source, a lot of early adopters and forward-thinking applications at the moment, but it's not nearly as pervasive as ECDSA or RSA at the moment. All right, so why is threshold at DSA challenging? If you remember, the first half of the signing equation is different from Schnorr. But if we're looking at this closely, you may ask, wait, is threshold at DSA actually challenging? because the signing equations are identical. The way that we derive the signatures are identical, and so the verification equation is going to be identical. The signatures look exactly the same. So nobody is going to be able to tell whether you use threshold, Schnorr, or threshold at DSA. This is almost by definition, like from security at DSA. So why not just do that? Like, why not just use a simple threshold Schnorr protocol? In order to give a more nuanced answer to this, we have to understand why at DSA has nonlinear signing to begin with. So each Schnorr signature uses a fresh one-time nonce given by K and R. This is in the algorithm. Security, it turns out, is extremely sensitive to the distribution of this nonce. So there are these great works using all sorts of nice techniques with lattices that show that with even a small amount of bias in the sampling of K, you can completely destroy the crypto system. As in, if it turns out that even if I think the state-of-the-art attacks only need like 1 bit of bias or something to be able to completely retrieve the signing key from a biased Schnorr signer. And this turns out to be a major issue in practice because it's not as easy as it seems on paper to get true randomness. This is due to the fact that, first of all, just pure entropy is hard to come by. And also there tend to be many, it's quite common to have errors in implementation, badly seeded PRGs, all sorts of things that go wrong in practice. And so this is a systems problem, but it turns out that there's an easy cryptographic trick that you can use to completely mitigate the systems problem. Basically, instead of sampling K uniformly for each signature, we can compute K, the nonce, as a function a function f applied to some seed that you chose during key generation and the message. And so basically, this is sort of like a fun exercise to do if you're just taking a crypto class now. If you assume that f is a pseudo-random function, the distribution of the K values that you derive like this are going to be indistinguishable from the K values of the Schnorr algorithm, which is to sample them uniformly. So the great thing is that this little trick solves the randomness issue without compromising on security. So this is why Fdsa has a nonlinear signing equation, because it mitigates this randomness vulnerability with deterministic nonce derivation. So there are many different ways to think about this. One of the first things that may come to your mind if you're used to playing around with these cryptographic tools is why not just keep a counter, right? Like keep some sort of counter on your device, and every time you have to sign a new message, just invoke your pseudo-random function on this counter and then increment the counter. So you're guaranteed that every time you ask for new randomness, you will get it because the counter is always fresh. But this introduces a new attack surface. Basically, using the same counter twice is just as bad as reusing a nonce, which is like the universe explodes if that happens, basically. So this is an issue in practice because it could happen that you reuse state, as in state that you already used previously, but you somehow come back to this point. This can happen because of power supply interruptions. For instance, if your computer turns off and turns back on again, and it rolls back to something that was before, like to a point in time that was actually before the last thing that you did. When you're restoring from a backup, for instance, it's really hard for a cryptographic library to have that level of access in the stack to figure out that it's been restored from a backup and that it shouldn't be trusting the state that it's been given. And also it's common to, for instance, load virtual machines with old snapshots, like snapshots that have already consumed the counter, but you've loaded it again. This can happen for many reasons. This can be adversarially induced, like someone could, for instance, just like cut power at some opportune time, especially if you're in a embedded device. Or it could just be due to careless mistakes. Like it's entirely possible to restore state without knowing that it's stale. And yeah, this sounds like a systems problem. Like, why do we have to care about it as cryptographers? Essentially, the systems community showed that this is a difficult problem to solve. It's called state continuity, and it's difficult even on dedicated hardware. So there are broadly two flavors of solutions. One is using some sort of helper node, which doesn't really matter for us because we don't want to introduce new parties to solve a multi-party problem. The other is special purpose hardware. That is, you buy hardware whose sole purpose is to keep track of a counter or something. This is unsatisfying because for one, it introduces extra physical assumptions. And quantitatively, this is bad because it costs extra money if you have to buy a new device every time you want to like do a threshold signing setup. And it's also turns out to be really slow, like the order of 60 to 100 milliseconds just to increment a counter on a trusted device. And there are other problems, like it comes with a limited lifespan because non-volatile memory can wear out pretty quickly. This is all work that's been explored in the systems community. And so we asked, in the case of threshold signatures, maybe it can be a crypto problem. Like just like DSA solves this, well, that idea predates DSA, but just like a deterministic signing solves this problem of bad randomness, can we solve this problem of stateless, of like state being hard to maintain in practice on the cryptographic protocol design level? So what we asked is, how can we design a threshold DSA protocol that enjoys the same benefits of deterministic signing as DSA? Specifically, you shouldn't have to sample new state after you run your one-time key generation phase. And you should be able to restore crashed devices with long-term secrets rather than having to update state constantly. And we show that indeed using, like we developed some new cryptographic techniques and show that you can perform this operation perform threshold signing naturally, statelessly, and deterministically an order of magnitude faster than if you were to use trusted hardware. All, of course, while using our favorite thing, which is tools native to the object that we're thresholdizing, tools native to DSA. I don't have time to go into the technical details. So what I'll just do is talk about some open problems in threshold elliptical cryptography. The most obvious thing that you can do is, of course, can we do better, right? Like it's probably always possible to improve on efficiency because all of these are feasibility problems that have been solved in the 80s. So it's all about efficiency now. The question is, can you do better than what you're already doing in terms of efficiency? And also qualitative security guarantees, like stateless determinism also applies to ECDSA, not just FDSA. And maybe it's difficult to combine these two nonlinearities. There are also notions of security against mobile adversaries, like an adversary that jumps from system to system. Proactive security is about refreshing state between these epochs in time, basically. And that's like the one sentence summary. So that if, in case your entire system gets corrupted at some point, like hopefully you refresh the state between epochs in which certain devices were corrupt. So can we combine this with stateless deterministic signing? Because this seems kind of these two goals seem to be at odds in terms of maintaining state. Right, and then tailoring to context. Understanding what dimensions matter and like what really is an efficient protocol in practice is very dependent on what exactly your constraints are in practice. And so like maybe we can find new theoretical problems or new theoretical questions that come from things like constraints of memory or battery consumption in different environments that we want to deploy these protocols. And of course, there are always things like there is a standard model in crypto that we usually use, which is that all parties are connected to each other and they have certain like network assumptions between them or whatever. Maybe in certain scenarios, it's not very useful to assume that everyone has the same computing power, everyone has the same network speed, this kind of thing. So maybe we can look at custom communication patterns, study questions related to message complexity and things like this in the context of threshold crypto. This would be pretty cool. And finally, now that I'm done with ECDSA and IDSA, this marks the end of the elliptic curve section, and I'll say a bit about RSA. So RSA was one of the first candidate public key crypto systems that still survives, and it's been deployed widely across the internet. It has classic signature and encryption algorithms with security very roughly rooted in the factoring of large integers. It's not literally the factoring of large integers. The formal details are a bit different, but interestingly, the RSA crypto system also has a lot of modern applications, including fancy tools like new cryptographic primitives like accumulators, delay functions, snarks, and things like this. So threshold signing, as it turns out in RSA, is pretty easy to execute after you're done with distributed key generation. And so unlike ECDSA and FDSA, where it was key generation is easy, signing is hard, RSA is the other way around. Key generation is hard and signing is easy. And most modern applications, the ones that I mentioned just now, like fancy new crypto needs only the RSA public key. There's no actual need for the secret key, as it turns out. So we'll focus on the hard part of this problem, which is to create an RSA public key in a distributed way, so that the secret key that corresponds to the public key stays hidden if even one person who's involved in the creation of the public key was honest. So what is an RSA public key? Also known as a biprime, it's an integer capital N that's the product of P and Q, which are large secret random primes. You can think of large to mean somewhere between 2 to the 1000 to 2 to the 2000 in practice. The exact assumption depends on exactly how you use this modulus in a crypto system, but it's generally of the flavor that given N, working backwards to find out what P and Q you multiply to get it, or equivalently the order of Zn star, the phi of N or the distortion function, it can't be efficiently determined. So computing the order of the group is hard, the multiplicative group, Zn star. So sampling such a biprime, that is key generation for RSA, is done as follows in the single party case. First, you sample a random P, that's a k-bit number. If P is not prime, start again. Then this gives you a prime P, and sample Q the same way that you found P. And now you compute N as a product of P and Q. And that's it. You have your RSA modulus. Here you have your biprime. So this is where the difficulty lies. If P is not prime step, right, this primality testing is kind of non-trivial. And usually in the single party case, we use the Miller-Arbin test, which involves taking some random base A, raising it to the power P minus 1 mod P, which is painful because P has to be kept secret. So this is the problem for the multi-party case, this nonlinearity of the exponentiation and modular reduction. So the overview of a protocol, this is sort of the same template that's been followed in a bunch of historical works, is to begin by sampling P and Q as integers, which is kind of similar to how we did the secret key sampling in Schnorr, except over here it's over the integers instead of over ZQ binary difference. Then compute N is equal to the product of P and Q, because P and Q are both secret shared values. This is again similar to ECDSA. Then we do biprimality test on N. That is, instead of testing primality of P and Q individually, there's this really nice idea of Bonnier and Franklin, where we can directly test whether N is a product of two primes. So the advantage of this is that we can make N public. We don't have to keep it secret. So we don't have to do these irritating nonlinear operations inside of a scale computation. The downside is that now the probability that you hit a prime is that you don't hit a prime is squared, right? So that you hit a prime is squared, which is a bad thing. So concretely, this means that you go from hundreds of candidates for P and Q that you had to try to thousands of candidates that you have to try before you actually find one that works. And this is a really interesting open problem to work on, to see if you can reconcile these two things. If you can get the advantage of not keeping N secret while also keeping the number of failed candidates low, like while keeping the prime secret when testing it. Testing its primality. There was, I think, the last line of work that looked at this with Dunbar Mikkelsen, but the answer is still not particularly satisfying. Right. So, and we also have a retroactive consistency check. Basically, if N fails the biprimality test, we open everything up and check in a privacy-free fashion, which is quite light. Otherwise, we do like a one-time like heavy check to make sure that everything worked out, but while preserving privacy. So the first three steps are mostly shared by most works. So I'll talk about like what new insight we brought to this problem in our paper last year. We leveraged the Chinese remainder theorem for efficiency, where instead of sampling P and Q as k-bit integers directly, we sampled them in small chunks of size log k each. This helps with sieving because now each component is an integer mod mi, which is a unique prime and verified to be non-zero. And once we have this in place, we can use the Chinese remainder theorem to assemble these components into a full-size secret. And never mind the details of the Chinese remainder theorem at the moment, but essentially we can sample component-wise and assemble it to a big thing using the Chinese remainder theorem. And since each component is non-zero mod a small prime, the full-size values will not be divisible by the small primes mi. So this way, we kind of make sure that every candidate that we try is guaranteed to be indivisible by the first few primes. And this makes a huge difference in terms of the number of candidates that we have to try. because the smaller the prime, the more likely a large number is being divided by it. And it helps in multiplication. Basically, OT-based multiplication is quadratic in the size of the field. Again, if you just sort of work this out, if you're able to break this multiplication of a large thing down into a number of small multiplications, that's overall a winning strategy. And we're able to do that because of the Chinese remainder theorem. Break it up into small things and reassemble it once it's done. And finally, it like helps us plug some checks that I don't really have time to talk about. All of this combined, it adds up to like a factor K improvement to something in the previous work, where K is the security parameter, the size of the prime over here. And also we have like a nice clean framework, and we give proofs of what used to be fairly large monolithic protocols in like nice modular steps. So that's, I think, a great point of reference if this is a problem that interests you. Okay, so that's RSA that I managed to cover over here. So in summary, threshold cryptography is all about eliminating the single point of failure for secret key protection in a lot of crypto systems. And crypto systems that are deployed in the real world, that's ECDSA, DSA, RSA, have a lot of open questions regarding the thresholdization, like how to exploit the algebraic structure and things like this. Because we can't use generic MPC, we have to think about how to construct custom protocols, and think about how we can develop more interesting techniques for that. And yeah, so we saw an overview of techniques and challenges for these modern threshold crypto tasks, and I hope you found them interesting. And yeah, all of these papers you can find on my webpage. Hope you enjoyed them. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
So thanks a lot, Yashwanth. That was really a wonderful talk. So questions?
Hello, Yashwanth. That was a great talk. Thank you. I'm still wondering, okay, I understand that from the efficiency point of view, threshold signing is more efficient than applying MPC, general MPC protocol. But still, I'm wondering from the security point of view, do both the things achieve the same level of security?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in some of the works, they have these sort of like game-based definitions of security, where they say, okay, let's initialize a distributed system with these many players. The threshold object that comes out should be like unforgeable or something. But in all of our papers and a bunch of other papers as well, the security definition that we use is that we just take the algorithm for threshold signing and put it into like an ideal functionality. And we say that, like when we prove security in this like real ideal paradigm, we say that the protocol realizes the functionality of running the algorithm, of just running the like, threshold signing algorithm. So that's the exact same security guarantee that you would get if you were to use the multi-party computation to execute the algorithm. Like there's no compromise over there.
Okay. So should we think of threshold signing as like a more efficient way to do the MPC multi-party computation of the traditional SNOR algorithm? Is it? Can we think of like that? Okay.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
So any possibility of, I understand that you're looking for structure, right? So any possibility of adapting these things to LW based schemes?
Yeah, major open problem. That's something that we looked at as well. I think there are some works that do this for like certain encryption schemes, and like I think, especially given that NIST is looking at standardizing some post-quantum crypto schemes, like there's been, I think, a paper at PKC this year that constructs not exactly a threshold signature, but like a multi-signature of a signature that looks something like this. This Fiat-Shamir with the bots paradigm of Lyubashevsky. So like that's the best that we managed to do so far. So the state of the art in terms of threshold signature, like custom threshold signature protocols for lattice signatures is severely lacking.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have ideas, I'm all yours.
So sorry, one last question. How about thresholding AES? Because PRFs are used in for tag generation, right? I mean, so any hope of doing it, or it's still you see a lot of bottleneck?
Yeah. So on the one hand, it doesn't have structure, but on the other hand, we've gotten somewhat lucky. or maybe it's not coincidence, but the circuit size for AES is not that large. Like, whereas, for instance, Schnorr would be of the order, I mean, like elliptical exponentiations and things would be on the order of like many tens of millions of gates. AES is something like 7 or 8,000 gates. So it's quite feasible to run a generic MPC to compute AES. Like, I think so much so to the point that every time someone writes a new paper about generic MPC, one of the standard circuits to benchmark a generic MPC is AES.
True.
So like it's like well within the it's well within practical reach. Like I think using generic MPC to compute AES is already practical enough for a lot of applications.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So I have a question here. So you primarily focus on the dishonest majority setting, due to which you have to use a lot of this cryptographically secure tools like OT and so on. So what if we go for honest majority setting, completely a secret sharing based protocol? I understand in terms of resilience, it won't be that great. But in terms of computation, it might give you a lot of saving. So is there any work which has explored this?
Yeah, there is. So all of these problems, so definitely threshold RSA, like the first paper that looked at this problem was in the honest majority setting of Bonnet and Franklin in 97. And the protocol is very efficient, like because honest majority, everything is information theoretic, and they're able to create an RSA key. Like 20 years ago, I think that implementation was able to do it in like minutes or something. Which is like we're still in the order of like tens of minutes to do for dishonest majority. So that's for RSA. ECDSA, also there were like classic works from the 90s that show how to use. There's this trick of Barillon and Beaver from some old like pottery paper, I think, that does this like secure inversion thing, and it's very easy to do in an honest majority setting. So there's this paper of, I think, Gennaro and friends from like the mid 90s or something that does honest majority ECDSA. And I think to some extent that's also seeing some interest now, because again, like SCN in last year, there was a paper by Damgard and friends that like revisited the honest majority setting and gave some more efficient protocols for this. But it's all it's super efficient, as in you don't have to rely on crypto at all, because it can all be done information theoretically. So if you have the luxury of an extra server or something, or if it's an assumption that you can tolerate, then it's a lot faster.
Okay. Thank you. So let me see any questions in the chat window. Okay, so there are no questions. So are there any other questions from the audience? Okay. So if there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker Yashvanth again. Thanks a lot. That was really a very nice talk, giving a very high-level overview of what exactly threshold crypto is without going into too much details. I hope the audience have enjoyed the talk. And thank you everyone for joining. See you all. Bye.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. My pleasure.